Hello everyone and welcome to today's ACMP member webinar. Our topic today is Mastering Change Communications for Scalable Change Activation, presented by Nelly Wartoff. My name is Isolda Kanikani and I will be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I would like to share some information on the latest happenings at ACMP. First of all, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Tigerhall, whose support made this session today possible. Thank you again, Tigerhall, for being our sponsor. We also have several upcoming events to look forward to, so keep posted in this direction. Our next in-person event is Change Chicago. This event will be held in May 18th till the 21st in 2025, so of course coming up soon, and will offer cutting-edge insights into professional networking opportunities. Registration is open and early rates end February 21st, so get in there quick and be sure to register soon. Join us as we step into the future of change management with Change Makers Unplugged. A 2-hour session on February 18th offers a rare opportunity for professionals at all levels to deep dive into the most pressing trends and hottest topics shaping the change management landscape through roundtable sessions and discussions leading to the development of a white paper where you will be mentioned. Mark your calendars for Global Change Management Professionals Day on the 11th of February. Join the celebration by sharing your stories online with #GlobalCMDay. And don't miss the members-only webinar, Anticipating the Future, How Change Management Strengthens Strategic Foresight, to be presented by Bruno Colette. The Certified Change Management Professional, CCMP, is a globally recognized credential established by ACMP. The CCMP is a good way for practitioners to prove their expertise and knowledge, invest in their ongoing professional development, show their commitment to the ethical and professional requirements, and successfully apply change management best practices. Scan the QR code to visit our website where you can learn more about the CCMP. One of the most valued member benefits is our ACMP resource library, where you can access tens of years worth of member-only tools, webinars, conference presentations, and white papers. The resource library is consistently ranked as one of our top member benefits, so we hope you will take advantage of it. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping tips. All the audio lines have been muted, and today's webinar will run until 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have any questions during the presentation, please post those in the Q&A area. Questions for the presenters will be answered during and also after the presentation, where we'll leave a bit of time at the end. So be sure to join in the conversation and prompt from speakers in the chat. We love to see your input here for the session. So let's get interactive. And now I would like to introduce today's presenter. So we have Nelly Wartoff, is a Swedish technology entrepreneur reshaping enterprise change activation with Tigerhall, the platform she launched in 2019 to drive large-scale transformation engagement for global businesses. Backed by over 10 million from investors like Sequoia Capital and Monks Hill Ventures, Tigerhall powers transformation for Fortune 500 giants across 32 countries with teams in 12 markets. Named on Tatler's Gen T Leaders of Tomorrow and International Business Times top entrepreneur to watch in 2023. Nelly is a sought-after speaker and regularly presents at change and transformation forums, across the United States, Europe, and Asia, including TEDx, Cornell University, the Conference Board, Business Transformation Exchange, and the Change and Transformation Summit, USA. So Nelly, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Isolde. Thank you. Great to be here. And this chat is on fire. I was told before that this is a very active and engaged community, and all of you have already proven that. I'm seeing people from Oslo, from South Africa, from Nigeria, and all over the US and Canada. It's so great to see so many from all over the world. Thank you all for taking the time and for showing up for this topic. This is a topic that I've been obsessing about for 10 years. And 10 years ago, I felt like nobody cares about this. And nobody cares about how we communicate, how we drive change, and people just push things down people's throat and don't really care about what happens after that. And seeing almost 500 people show up to talk about this topic is just, I would not believe this 10 years ago that I would have 500 people interested in talking about change communications. So thank you for showing up. What I'm going to chat about is I'm going to share a little data and very tactical how-tos of how you can succeed in change communications. So as I said, I've spent 10 years obsessing about the topic, and the last 5 years doing this with large organizations across the world. So what I'm going to share with you is from data, what I've seen actually works and what doesn't work, and how you can do this in your organizations as well. Because there is nothing more important than driving successful change and transformation. And if we're not leading change, then what are we doing? And if we're not communicating about the change, then nothing will change. So let's dive in. And I'm going to start with a statistic that all of you know very, very well, that 70% of change and transformation initiatives are still failing. And why are they still failing? We don't see much issues in strategy and planning. We still have the big consulting firms being paid millions of dollars to do a 150-page PowerPoint deck, and there you got your strategy and planning done, right? So you've got a great strategy, you've got this great plan, then somehow CEOs around the world still believe that I can have this plan and I send it to my 50,000 employees and they're going to get it and everything is going to change. Who thinks that's going to work? But still CEOs believe that that's going to work. So the most underestimated part in change is, how do we activate this? How do we activate this at scale with large groups of people who are not involved in implementing that 150-page PowerPoint deck and creating it, but rather are busy with their full-time jobs, their everyday work, right? So the activation side of change is really, really missing. And when I say activation, I mean communications, which is what we're going to talk about today. And then also capability building. How do we avoid these CEOs going out and saying, hey, we're an AI company now. And then people on the ground are like, what's ChatGPT? How does this work? So capability building also being an important part. And then the culture that actually enables and allows us to drive the change that we need to drive. So we'll tackle communications today, but overall in activation, you have all of those three components playing together. And how are companies doing communication today? Well, you know this and you've seen this. It's usually a ton of emails. I spoke with a chief transformation officer of a large financial services group a couple of weeks ago, and he's got around 80,000 employees. And I asked him, how are you driving change? And he said, my team sends 10 emails a day. So that's 800,000 emails going out every day on this financial services group servers to just tell people about the change. And I asked him about his open rate, and it was the 6-7% that most organizations are experiencing. So this top-down, one-size-fits-none, throw everything at people is clearly not working. And actually, these are the things that lead to even more resistance and confusion and change fatigue. And then you have it very fragmented. It's unstructured across so many different destinations. There is something in a SharePoint over here, then there's something happening in a town hall, then there's something on the intranet, and then you have to go to the LMS for something else. And employees are like, how am I supposed to make sense of this? I usually compare this to watching a Netflix show and imagine seeing the second half of episode 8 before you see the first half of episode 2. That is most employees' experience as they are going through change. How are they going to make sense of that? Like, who's the cast? What happened? Who cheated on who? Where did we go? Like, no understanding of what's going on. So it's very piecemeal, and they miss usually 80 to 90% of it. And then employees are not part of it, right? They feel like someone is talking at me. I'm not heard. I don't have a voice in this. They don't care what I have to say. So if they don't care about what I have to say, then I'm not going to care about what they have to say, right? That's naturally how human beings work. So there is no organizational involvement at scale either. And this is why we're seeing this increased activation gap that has been happening over the past 10 years. And this is why 10 years ago, when I started obsessing about this, nobody really cared, because it was like 1 or 2 changes happening per year back in 2014. And that's something that employees could handle, right? Like you had 70, 80% of organizational support back in 2014. So this used to be the state. But then this is research from Gartner. What has happened over the last 10 years is change has moved from being 1 or 2 things happening a year to now being 15 impacts per employee per year. So 15 different changes, that's more than 1 a month, that are impacting them in different ways. And usually many large organizations are very matrix, so you would have things happening from left, right, and center, and all coming at you from different angles. So with everything in the previous slide, with all those emails and SharePoint sites and confusing Netflix series, take all of that times 15. And that's what employees are going through. So no wonder that support for change has now dropped to what used to be like 70, 80%. People used to be, yeah, I'm super all in, like, let's do this. Like, this is the change of the year, we can do this. To now being, hang on, another flavor of the month, another executive coming in, another change happening. Like, what is this? Like, most employees today are just thinking, if I can just ignore this and not care about it and wait long enough, this change is going to pass, and I don't really have to do anything. So we've seen change support actually drop down to close to 30%, 38% last year, from previously 74, 80% levels. So this leaves us with a massive activation gap where we need to increase the support for these changes, and it's going to be more and more and more changes happening. So how do we close that gap? Because if we don't, then we're going to see all of this, and all of you have seen much of this as well, where people are uncertain, where they don't understand what's happening. That leads to morale issues, decreased productivity. Nobody really knows what's going on. And I'm sure many of you have seen these changes where you hear about something that's going to happen next year. So then everyone sits around and waits and waits and waits until that change is happening. And they think it's better if I just don't do much at all until that actually happens. So you see massive loss of productivity. Top talent tends to leave because they don't put up with this. Like, what is this shit going on? And everything is happening and they don't involve me, they don't include me, I don't feel heard. So you see people leaving. And then, of course, the most common, every single project gets delayed, budgets overrunning, transformation and change becomes very, very expensive because people are just not bought in and not included in that change. So we need to change the approach in which we do communication around changes, because if we're going to have 15 changes per year, we cannot send 10 emails a day times 15 initiatives and just have everyone read 150 emails a day and expect them to change their mindset and change their behavior because they receive those emails. So we need to move from this, what I call the forcing function, which is very one way, top down, you do as I say, or else you're out of here, very military style, which does not work in 2025. We have a completely different workforce, and we hire people because we want them to think and to be creative. But then when we're leading change, we tell them not to think, because this change is happening to you whether you want it or not. So don't think, but we're hiring you because we want you to think. So it's a very odd kind of relationship with the employees as well, right? And then moving away from this scattered and fragmented noise that is working in most large organizations today. So we want to move from this to what I call an activating function. So making a two-way, bottom-up, making people feel included, involved, like they are part of it, driving change with people, not against them, personalized at scale, not having those same 150 emails sent to every single person, because Bob is going to perceive it different to what Stephen does. So personalization is required. And when you think of marketing, right, You would never dream of creating a marketing plan and then go out and marketing to every single consumer in the same way. That would never happen in marketing. But somehow it happens in change communications over and over and over again. You create one email, send it to everyone, and call it a day. So we need personalization at scale, and then these integrated journeys of storytelling. So not this a little bit here and there, the scattered Netflix series. We need one journey, one holistic space of storytelling. So this is the shift that needs to happen in communication for this to actually work and be successful. So let's get into how do we do this? How do we master change communications at scale? And most of the work that we're doing is with large organizations. Think like the largest we work with is 250,000 employees. The smallest is around 500. And then most in between are like 30, 40, 50,000 employees. So this is built for working at scale. Because if you have 50 people, then you can just do one-to-ones and go around and talk to them. But if you have 50,000 people, that's going to take you the next 100 years, and then the change is going to be irrelevant. So there are 7 steps. The type of messaging that you drive makes a very big difference. So I'll show some data around this. The communication style and how you deliver it, how you personalize, how you reinforce it, not calling it once and done and then get out of there. The feedback loops to make people feel involved, and then what are some best practices in addressing the sentiment that you get out of those two-way feedback loops. So this is what I'll go through. Isolde, any questions from the chat? I see things popping up before we dive in.
Yeah, great timing. One has just come in, and this is from Anea. I hope I say your name correctly, Anea. So the question is, wondering about the language of making people feel included and including people. Does anybody find that language shift matters?
Absolutely does. And we'll cover that actually in the first one, the type of messaging. So a very well-timed question. Thank you. Okay, so looking at how we message and the type of language, that is exactly what makes a very big difference. If there's only one thing that you take away from this hour, please let it be this. People actually aren't afraid of change, but they're shit scared of identity loss. And this is the biggest wrong that I see, or the biggest mistake that organizations make when they go out and talk about change. They talk a lot about the how and the processes and what needs to change and the new ways of working and how to use this tool and that tool, but they don't talk about who we are. Who are we? Who are you? What is your inclusion in this? And how are we changing together? It's a lot of focus on just what to do and what not to do. And when people think of their identity, this is where most change comes from, right? And it's that analogy like, are you a smoker or a person who smokes cigarettes? Are you a vegan or a person who eats vegan food? Your identity, if you call yourself a smoker or a vegan, is a lot stronger than if you say, sometimes I smoke cigarettes or sometimes I eat vegan food. So if you're looking at people who are going to stop smoking, that's one of the first things that you work on, is actually moving from telling yourself that you're a smoker to just saying, I smoke cigarettes from time to time, because that's immediately what's going to decouple you from that. So people's identity control their actions, their mindsets, their behaviors. And if you can shape their identity, that is going to make all of the how, all of the processes follow automatically from the rest of it. So when we look at these two different messaging types, you have reshaping identity, and then you have the ones who are reshaping processes and workflows and have that as their main mantra. This is the difference in the change adoption curve of those changes and also the sentiment that follows with it. So clearly the one that is reshaping identity leads to much higher positive sentiment throughout. And that is also a precursor for driving change. And positive sentiment doesn't need to be everyone is loving it and like, this is going to be great. It just means that they feel like, okay, this is something that is exciting, that is stimulating me, something that I can get behind, and this is going to be interesting. That's the kind of sentiment that you like. So that's higher. And when you look at just reshaping processes and workflows, people are a lot more like, okay, whatever, another tool, another process change, and you see the adoption curve being shaped thereafter. So how do you make this shift? How do you move from this processes and workflows focus to actually reshaping identity? And this is what we see the difference being between the organizations who do these in two different ways. So if you look first at, this is the most common, though, on the left side, where you have reshaping processes and workflows. They do a little bit of the why in the beginning and just like, hey, everyone, this is why we're doing this. They dive immediately into the stakeholder impact mapping and the messaging, and then they ram through the how. And everything is around, how do we execute this process? How does this work? It's almost at the level like where to click. And it's like, this is where you click in this new ERP system, or this is how you change this in the machine. And it's very much around how can you execute this new process. And then towards the end, there's a little bit of reinforcement and also some success stories. But primarily the main messaging that they drive is around the how. And it's a lot of support around where to click and what to do differently. But they don't really talk about why should we do this differently or how are you involved in doing this differently. If we contrast that to the ones on the right, where it's more focused on reshaping identity, these organizations spend a lot of time on the journey and actually putting the current state of the organization in a story of a past, present, and future. So there's a very clear narrative of the journey that they're on. And we all know that humans respond very well to storytelling. So the better storytellers you can be, the better change communication will be. And it's all about telling the right story. And the best, they actually tie their stories into their external orientation. So if we take AI as an example, right? Instead of going in and telling everyone this is exactly how you use this new AI tool or how you use ChatGPT, instead of hammering down the technology, they talk about we can be part of this bigger trend. This is a big movement happening in the world. It's affecting everyone in the industry, and we can be part of it. And this is how we can support our customers. And they talk about it from their customers' worlds and from the external world. Because what most leaders underestimate is that many people inside an organization, especially in large legacy organizations where people might have been there for 20, 25, 30 years, many people actually are not very good with looking externally. So then they feel like it's another change, it's another idea, and it's just something we came up with internally to do some change for the sake of it. But they think it's very much an internal idea that some leader came up with. They don't really understand the context of this is where the world is moving and this is where our industry is moving. And then if they can be made feel like they're part of that change and they're part of that entire journey, that makes people a lot more excited. So focus on your presence in the marketplace and the customers' worlds. And then when it comes to the how, they lead with success stories of the change and who has done it really well, as opposed to more and more of like, this is how you should do it. They look at like, hey, look at John over there. John is leading with this and focusing on that identity and how that new identity is exemplified. So if we take the AI example in finance, for example, if you have Susan priding herself on, I am the fastest accountant in this manual process, she's not going to take it very well if you come and say, we're going to automate that process. That's going to affect her identity, right? But if you shape Susan's identity to be, you're the most forward-thinking person in accounting, and that's the way that you work around your change messaging, then she's going to be like, yeah, I am forward-thinking, and I'm part of this journey as part of the industry, and this is the identity, and she can then exemplify it. So very big difference in how organizations go out and talk about this. And it does show in the data when you look at how people are responding to this type of messaging.
And I have a couple more questions for you, Nelly, if skip moment.
Skip moment, let's take questions.
For the first one, so we have one from Stephanie, and she says, do you have any thoughts on addressing change fatigue? Well, we cannot control the rapid amount of change. So how do we, sorry, I'm just reading. So how do we mitigate the risk that comes with change fatigue? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a very good one. And it's very common everywhere, right? The number one thing to address change fatigue or combat change fatigue is the storytelling and which level you place the story at. So if you have a high-level story of, let's say, innovation, and then your changes are fitting into that narrative, you can actually keep playing that narrative of innovation, and AI is going to fit in, and changing in go-to-market model is going to fit in, like most of the things you're doing will fit in. the change fatigue usually appears when you have changes that are happening that do not tie into your story, or where you don't have that overarching story. Because as long as people have that overarching story, they still feel it's one change. But if they feel like it's something happening over here, then there's something else, and then there's something else over there, and then Susan comes with a fourth thing, that's what drives change fatigue, and that feeling of just too many changes happening at once. But if it's 4 steps in the same journey, then that's where change fatigue disappears. So it comes back to storytelling and having that one overarching story. The hardest part is when CEOs are changing, because if you have a new CEO, it's a new story and so on. But if you have the same CEO that can tell the same story over a number of years around where the company's moving, that's very powerful in combating change fatigue.
Great, thank you. I've got a second one here for you. That is from Dana. How do you personalize at scale if you have a large number of impacted personas and limited resources to craft and deliver communications? The simple path most teams default to is the one-size-fits-all, because it takes more effort to personalize and to target communications. What are your thoughts here?
Very true. That's a very good question. I'm going to save that to the personalization element and chat a bit about that. And I'll also talk about it at the end, how you can do more with less resources. Thank you.
Thank you.
So then we can have this right type of messaging. We can talk about identities. We can have the right storytelling, but how do we deliver it? And are we still going to do this on those 1,000 emails, or is there another path? If we look at trust and where we stand in society today, assume that you have 0 trust when you go out and communicate to people. If we look at government, media, global trust in CEOs, everything is at an all-time low. So you kind of have to start with thinking from a delivery point of view that there is no trust. And there is just like no one, even in CEOs, with the exception of India, most countries do not even trust their CEOs, and politicians even worse, and media even worse. So how do we combat that lack of trust when it comes down to the communication style? So looking at how leaders communicate, again, this is our data when we compare how people speak in their change communications. So you have this very raw, authentic, unscripted communication style, people who dare to go off the script and just talk about something, make it personal and be real and be authentic. And then you have the ones that need a script, they need 12 PR people in the background, they need the green screen, the suit and tie, and everything controlled, recorded, do not make it live. And this is the data that we see when we ask people afterwards, like, do you trust your leader's decision-making? Do you believe that your leaders tell you the truth? And are you excited to be part of this organization? Comparing the data just based on correlation to how the leaders communicate, this is what that looks like. So clearly people are craving more authenticity, more raw realness, and just being close to their leaders. And this is one of the reasons that TikTok grew so fast ahead of Instagram, right? Because Instagram is curated, it's perfect, whereas TikTok is just raw and real and tell it as it is. And that's the kind of communication style that resonates with people. So the top 5 things that you can do to increase trust is to have that kind of communication style where just raw, real, authentic, say it as it is. Two-way feedback loops is critical. There is nothing worse than CEOs going out and saying, I don't want to hear what they have to say. I don't want to see their feedback. I don't care what their comments are. You need two-way feedback loops, and we're going to talk a bit more about this later when we get to that. Communicating when there are no news or updates to report, incredibly powerful. To just go out and say, same time, same day, every week, this is what is happening or what is not happening. Because many organizations I see, they stop communicating when nothing is happening. So they would be, nothing is going on, we're delayed or whatever happens. So like, there's nothing to communicate this week. So let's just skip this week's town hall or email or however you're communicating. Worst, absolute worst thing, because when people don't hear anything, they're going to start making up their own rumors and their own stories and their own ideas of what is going on. So when you have nothing to report, just go out and say that. We have nothing to report. Nothing is happening this week. How are you doing, John? What's happening in your part of the world? That's the most effective communication. And we worked with one, we called it Fridays with Frank. This was a CEO of a large technology company. And he did Fridays with Frank, 11 a.m. every Friday, and just went out and talked to people. And he would bring in some employees and bring in some different people to his like show called Fridays with Frank. And people knew that every Friday at 11, I'm going to see what Frank has to say and just hear what is going on or what is not going on. And then transparency around the pros and cons, because people know it's not perfect and people want to be treated like adults, right? There is nothing worse than leaders going out and saying that, hey, this is going to be a win-win-win change. The employees are going to win, the customers are going to win, Wall Street is going to win, everyone is going to win. There is no such thing. And many times, like CEOs have this habit of going out and saying that we're going to change the world and save the environment and this and that, when really what they're chasing is like 2% operating margin points for Wall Street. And I'm like, it's fine to chase operating margin points for Wall Street. Like we all know that we live in a world where capitalism and public companies is a core part of it, right? And that's what is required to run a company. So just talk to people about that. There's no need to sugarcoat it or wrap it into a world-saving story. Just be transparent about like, what are the pros and cons? Why do we have to do this? What's the downside of doing this? Who might be negatively impacted? Because people know that there will be a negative impact too, so no point in hiding it. And just treat people like adults. By far the most effective thing you can do in increasing trust. And then leaders are sharing their personal change experience because they're also going through change. And many times people forget that every single middle manager and leader is also impacted by change, right? So when they share their own personal stories and what they're going through, super, super powerful. And then personal or relatable environments in a virtual world. So this is interesting. We did some comparisons between virtual backgrounds and non-virtual backgrounds. And when you look at people having a fake background, like what this guy is having here, like with a perfect kind of office background, trust in those leaders tend to be 30 to 35% lower than if you just have clear background or like nothing that is hiding what is behind you. And people don't think about this consciously, but unconsciously, it signals, what are you hiding? What do you not want to show for me? Are you not coming here as your whole self? And what are you trying to combat? So those personal, relatable environments are also very, very effective. Then the delivery methods. When we look at how we are delivering all of this, because we could have that right type of messaging, the right communication style, but looking at how we deliver it, the bar for delivery has been raised, right? And this is not by SharePoint. It's not like people are coming in to work on a Monday morning and go, PDF on SharePoint. I couldn't be more excited. I can't wait to dive into this PDF. After a weekend of Amazon, Spotify, TikTok, Netflix, and then Monday morning, gotta love SharePoint. So the way that we communicate outside of work is just miles and miles and leaps and bounds ahead of how we communicate at work. And this is why those SharePoint sites number 50,000 is not going to drive the change message forward, right? Because it's not how people are communicating. It's not how people are consuming information and connecting with each other. And I like the survey that said 46% of respondents to the survey believe that using email means their company is lagging behind with technology. So just email is already, you're way behind the times. So we need to get out of email and into something a bit more modern than email and SharePoint. Now, let me ask you if you can guess how much of global corporate communications is in written format and in the English language. Let me see if I can open the chat. And on a percentage level, 0 to 100, any guesses? You are good. 870%. I love that. That's a good guess. Yep, you're very much in the ballpark. It's 85% or even more than 85%. So corporate comms, written and English. Way too much, exactly, Jennifer. Now, how much of global content consumption, so this is at work and outside of work, is in written format and in the English language? Global content consumption. 20, 15. Someone said 1, 2. Also very good guesses. It's 4%. So globally, the way that people consume content in general, 4% is written in English. But then again, at work, 85% is written in English. 7 times 7 ways, exactly, a very good way to be heard. So what this tells us is when we go out, especially for you in a global large organization with people around the world, we speak a language that don't resonate both in how we communicate and the actual geographical language that we speak. So this is a very big difference. And that is why it's so important to be multimodal, because not everyone is a reader, multilingual. And this is, I've met, especially in the US, people are like, but if people work for an American company, they speak English, right? Yes, they do speak English when they interact with people in the company. But when it comes to consuming information, consuming content, they still want to do that in their native language. It's a whole other level of comfort. So multimodal, multilingual, and also multi-access. Like not everyone wants to go into a SharePoint site. People like to be listening, watching on the go when they're out and about. So multi-access is also super key. And if you look at the reach, this is interesting. So this is our data on different content formats and who consumes it and in what language. So when you look at an audience, say you have 100 people, if you're sending an email to them, which is usually mostly in English, that email would reach, usually most companies have an open rate of anywhere between 6 to 9% of the organization. If you're hosting a mandatory town hall, you could get usually around 20% showing up to that town hall. I know some organizations have like 30%, some have 10%, but around 20% tends to be the ones that you show up to a town hall. Now look at the reach at these formats. And when you add the non-English component. So if you look at video, right, like just adding a bit of video can get up to 30%, so that's still higher than a town hall. But then look at the non-English audience consuming video, especially in Asia. There is nothing more powerful than video in local language to communicate to an Asian audience. And I spent 13 years in Asia. We're headquartered in Singapore. This is what resonates with people. Sending an English email from headquarters in Chicago to Indonesia, big fail. That's not how people are consuming it. If you look at the people who are the most engaged on social media, spend the most time on social media, it's Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand. And the rest of Asia are pretty much on their phone, on multimedia as well. Podcasts, very popular in English-speaking markets, especially the US, because Americans like to be effective and efficient and do things at the same time. So if I can listen when I'm driving or listen when I'm cooking, that's awesome. So this is where people love podcasts. And this, again, allows you to reach more than half, almost half of the audience that you're aiming to reach. And then getting up to those 80% audience reach levels, both with video and with podcast. So just by allowing people to have it multimodal, different formats, do you want to listen? Do you want to read? Do you want to consume it in English? Do you want to consume it in your local language? Providing that variety increases your reach about 9x when it comes to just getting your change message out there. Then we have personalization. I'm going to move the questions to the end, Isolde, because I'm a little bit conscious of time. We can take them towards the end. So personalization, a lot of you asked about this. So I'm going to speak about the data part of personalization and the data points that you can use to personalize. So the static data, if we start here, this gets you around 40% of personalization. So I'm talking about function, seniority, geography, tenure. These are data points that you usually have in your HRIS system or ERP system, usually like HRIS. And just personalizing based on, he's the CFO in Japan and she's a new SDR in Mexico, that already puts you 4x ahead of what most organizations do. Most organizations still just send the same email to everyone, and regardless of if they've been there for 20 years and work in finance, or if they are just 2 days in and they work in sales. So this takes you a very long way. Then if you can add in the workflow activity, meaning where are they at in the workflow? And if you're doing an ERP implementation, for example, being able to customize your communications based on if someone has just started a workflow compared to if they're at the end of something else. And if you take a HRS, then you might launch that in January, but the performance module might not be something that people are using until October, November, when performance reviews come about. So you don't want to send out all the comms about how to use the performance module and what that means in January, because no one is really going to pay attention. But you want to see, when do they start that workflow, and when do they start doing that when they kick in closer to October, November. And also the stage of transformation. Where are people at in that? People are different levels of the change curve. How do we cater to that? And then the last piece around transformation response data. This takes you another 40% towards the 100%. And this is where you have sentiment, or you have areas of concern. There are different WIFM drivers, and also how engaged they are in the initiative, right? You want to talk very differently to someone who's all-in positive champion to someone who's not very engaged and thinks this is probably not a good idea and has a lot of concerns about job security. So this is where you use those two-way feedback loops to get into that transformation response data too. So these are the 10 most effective points that you can use for personalization and getting them together. But getting the static data, just starting at function, seniority, geography, tenure, this gives you around 40% of the effect of personalization already. So these are 10 points you can use. And then coming to reinforcement. This is where many organizations think that it's a once and done, let's send this all out, and then we hope people get it. So that, someone mentioned in the chat, 7 times 7 ways, right? Tends to be forgotten very often. So how do we reinforce? We want to reinforce where people are and where they see it. So if you think of the different channels that you have at your disposal, if you think of them as high frequency of usage compared to low frequency of usage, and then you have high level of noise and low level of noise, which of these 4 buckets do we want to be in? And you can put this in the chat. And let's call this bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3, bucket 4. Where do we want to speak to people? A lot of people say 1, some say 2. Someone wants to be here. Low frequency of usage, high level of noise. 1. You are very smart people. Number 1 is where we want to be. We want to be where it's high frequency of usage, where people actually are, where they hang out, where they will see your message. And then when there is low level of noise, so not overwhelming them. Now, again in the chat, any ideas of what are the tools that have low frequency of usage and high level of noise? What are the tools that are on the opposite of this green area? We've got email, SharePoint. Not for sure. Noise would be negative, yeah, exactly, where people feel like it's too noisy and it's hard to keep up. Teams, yes, exactly. Dual screens. These are the 4 that tend to show up at these areas for most organizations. The intranet, the LMS platform, SharePoint sites, and definitely email. So email have high frequency of usage, but also extreme level of noise. And most people actually almost entirely stop checking their inboxes. People used to be, there's still some inbox zero people out in the world, but most people have just moved, especially with the introduction of Teams and so on, they just don't look at emails the way they used to. So these are the 4 with the highest level of noise and the lowest frequency of usage. And where do we drive change? In these 4. These are the top 4 most common channels that change communications happens. Most of it is in email, in SharePoint, something in the LMS and intranet. This is the channels that we're currently using. So what do we want to use instead? What are some things that will be high frequency of usage and lower level of noise? Bathrooms is a good idea. Should do much more in the bathrooms. The coffee machine, 1-to-1. Walk the floor is great, but hard to do if you have 50,000 people. Exactly, direct messaging, Teams channels. So some function-specific tools are good, but many times hard to include communications in. But the best ones are your direct messaging, the team meetings, the collaboration channels, like where people are for their day-to-day work, right? So Teams are great, and having that pop up where they work in those chats where they are collaborating. So this is where we want to drive reinforcement. So reinforcement by sending more emails tend to be less effective. Reinforcement by telling people to go to the intranet where they go once a year to submit their annual leave, also less effective. but very effective when you can get into the team meetings that they have, the collaboration channels, the direct messaging on Teams, and getting that to where people work. So that is where we would like to reinforce it. Then feedback loops, big one. You can do all of this, but if you don't have feedback loops, it's still many times falling a bit flat in terms of getting people involved. So we spoke about the personalization data with the static data, the dynamic metadata, and the transformation response data. This is what you want to get from the two-way feedback loop. So you're doing two-way feedback loops to get sentiment, to understand people's areas of concern, get their WIFM drivers, what's in it for me, and see their engagement levels in the initiative. This is what will allow you to personalize much better if you're getting this information through the two-way feedback loops. Now, the biggest mistake I see companies doing is I ask them, hey, have you set up a two-way feedback loop? And they go, yeah, we have this email inbox that people can send their questions to, and then we respond every month. Not a good feedback loop. No one is going to go to a separate email address, send their questions and concern to someone they don't know who it is, and then expecting a response in the next 30 days. Not a good feedback loop. You want them to be instant. So this is the triple I strategy for feedback loops. You want them to be instant. So right where people are getting the enablement, the communications, the messaging, that's where you want that instant feedback loop. It should be a two-way conversation, not I'm sending something to you and then you can go somewhere else and respond to me. That's not how we chat with people, right? If you're chatting with your friends and family, you're not going to send your response somewhere else. You're going to send it where they are. So instant, interactive, has to be two-way, and informal. A lot of organizations go out and say, like, oh, we want your feedback on this initiative. Please fill out this 50-question survey before next Friday. And that's not a natural way for people to engage and to talk and to share feedback. So that informal piece is very key. And don't make it more work for them, right? Don't create that 50-page survey, but make it informal, more like chatting with friends. Very key. And then lastly, when it comes to addressing the sentiment, some best practices here. So when it comes to generating sentiment analysis, AI is your best friend. If you can get input that are from your, might have those surveys, MPS quizzes, but also comments, reactions, chat messages. For those of you who are on Microsoft Teams, if you can get your hands on the Microsoft Graph data, you will get very, very powerful sentiment analysis. You might need a discussion with your legal team before you can go there, but the most effective type of data, because that tells you what are people saying, what are they chatting with each other, what are their reactions to different messaging. So you can see most of that comes with Microsoft Graph data. And then the treatment you need is prompt engineering. So this is where that skill comes in handy, and using an AI tool that can actually treat all of the sentiment. And then the output that you want to get are user stories. So user stories based on the different audiences you're working with. You want to get to a point where you have heat maps. Word clouds tend to be pretty easy to get, and a good place to start as well. An important thing to note about sentiment is that you want to see trends over time. So I see companies doing this, like they do it once or twice, and they're like, yeah, it wasn't very useful. Yeah, because you need a baseline first to see how it develops over time. And that is what is useful. A point-in-time check is okay, but it's not that much you can do with it. But you want to see the third time onwards, how is this developing over time? And if you can do this daily, weekly, and seeing how it changes, that's where you have what is actually helpful in sentiment analysis. And some best practices, build groups for themes instead of themes for groups. I see many doing like, oh, like marketing cares about, or they think it's a useless change. So let's go to the marketing team and tell them why this change isn't useless. And finance don't trust leadership, so let's talk to them about their lack of trust in leadership. And HR is concerned about job security. And then you go and talk to HR about job security. This is not the best way to do it. The much better way of doing it is looking at, okay, who cares about job security? These people. And how can we talk to them? Because if you go to marketing and tell them about how this is not a useless change, actually half of them are not going to think, like they're not going to care about what you're telling them. They're just going to think about, but I think it's a pretty good change. So why are you telling me this? So they're going to be confused, and you're going to seed seeds that you don't want to seed, that they weren't even thinking in the first place. So you're only really addressing half of sentiment if you take a theme for group approach instead of groups for themes. And then addressing the ones that think it's a useless change, the ones that don't trust leadership, and addressing it per their concerns rather than where they sit in the organization. That's a much better way of doing it. And reinforcing the positive sentiment too. So not just go out and be like, oh, you're worried about this, you're worried about that, and I'm going to talk to you about it, but also reinforce like, this is what we've heard from you. We hear that you're super excited about this new change and the direction we're going, and many of you really, really like this. So reinforce all the positive feedback that you're getting as well, so that that doesn't get lost in the panic of addressing negative sentiment. And then there's a matrix that I like called the influence attitude matrix. So this is where you can then plot people on a positive versus negative sentiment scale, and then high influence versus low influence. So if you plot out people, and this is usually for smaller audience, if you have a group of say like 50 to 100 people, if you have 50,000 people, it's a bit harder to do this at scale. But if you have Bob and Susan and John and Eric and all of these people that you're mapping out on this matrix, then what you can actually do is you can connect them to address sentiment from someone who's more positive and higher in influence than they are. But make sure that it's not connecting this one to this one. This is what most people think it is. Like, oh, the most positive and senior person, I'm going to ask them to tell this junior negative person about the change. Not going to work very well because they're not going to relate. But these are the connections that you want to make. So you want to make close in influence, close in sentiment, and have them affect that person that is just a little bit to the bottom left of themselves. So these are the kind of connections you want to make. And if you have a change champion network that you work with, also very effective to use them in this way. And when you have a proper sentiment analysis tool, you can actually map them out in this way as well. So that's another good way, so that not everything just comes from you and your change team, but that it actually comes from people they look up to and respect and trust as well. Very important. So that's in a nutshell the quick overview of 7 different areas that you can address for mastering change communications. It's how you message, the type of messaging you put out, how you communicate it and your communication style, how you deliver it, personalizing it, reinforcing it, always having those two-way feedback loops, and addressing the sentiment. And there was a question earlier, like, how do you do this when there is so much? This is very resource intensive, right? And I know this takes a lot of resources, a lot of headcount, a lot of budget, a lot of time. And the only thing that is harder than climbing Mount Everest is getting another headcount in change management. So this is what we've built Tigerhall around. So Tigerhall supports these areas. So we work with change teams to basically 10x what you can do with your existing team in all of these areas. And that's all the data that I shared is from the work we're doing in the space too. So what the platform does is it helps you create really, really good delivery methods, basically drag and drop a PowerPoint, and it turns into these short form, bite-sized podcast in 33 different languages, and people can choose how they want to consume your information. It's personalized, so very easy to use the data to personalize and get the right content to the right audience at the right time based on where they're at in their change journey and so on. And then reinforcement, so it goes into those team channels automatically. You don't have to lift a finger. So it goes to the right people in their DMs and in their channel groups when they need it. So it looks at the time, and then it's all integrated within Microsoft Teams. So you don't have to send them to 17 different destinations either. And then all the feedback loops are instant. So it's very much social. People can react, people can chat, they can reply, they can comment. So very social experience. And all of that data across all of these go into that sentiment that you're getting, so that you can address that sentiment in the best way and fine-tune your type of messaging and how you go out to different audiences and address them. So in a nutshell, Tigerhall helps you go from having decks like this sent out in 150,000 emails to having a personalized change journey for every single employee. And that leads to much higher buy-in, much higher engagement, and much higher success in change and transformation. So that's in a nutshell what we do. So helping you transform those documents to podcasts, videos, all those engaging formats, 33 languages, personalized, real-time feedback loops, and very easy to report on the progress and sentiment and change as well. So that's what I wanted to share. And I know we have 5 minutes for questions. I'm also available on LinkedIn or email. So anyone who wants to ask any questions that we don't have time for in the next 5 minutes, feel free to reach out to me as well. And I'm very happy to connect with all of you separately as well. But thanks again for showing up. Really, really cool to have this bigger group for this topic. And I hope that you found it helpful. Let's see if we have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Nelly. Also for, I think you've touched on so many poignant topics. And if you look at the chats, actually, it's been prompting a lot of great thoughts coming out there. So yeah, we only have a few minutes left. So let's kick in with a couple of questions and then we'll see if we can get some answered also offline. So we'll come back on that one. But let's just kick in with the first one. So we have one from Lindsay. What do you recommend for personalization or reinforcement in organizations with managers who don't have fundamental leadership skills, aka communication, EQ, etc.?
So if they don't have, so the question was if they don't have fundamental leadership skills, EQ, like how do you do personalization reinforcement?
Yeah, and EQ was an example of one of the skills they could have.
Okay, so if that's the case, I would look at the 10 personalization points and probably add in points around like their levels at those. And that's something that I see many organizations do successfully as well, is they add in like what is their change readiness, for example, is another data point you can add in, or what are their levels of knowledge in like or level of readiness in EQ, their skill levels, and then personalizing to that. So looking at where people are at because they will be at different levels. And then if it's things like, yeah, leadership EQ, like starting with that, I mean, your messaging starting around those topics, but looking at the different readiness and skill levels, I would recommend being the first step, if I understood that question correctly.
Great, thank you, Nelly. Okay, I'm going to kick into another one. And this is from an anonymous attendee. I am a change leader for an enterprise-wide ERP implementation and have developed change management strategy and plans for core users with ADKAR model and framework. What is your advice to handle non-core user groups that are not impacted by this change, but insist that they are and want to be communicated and trained, but they don't do their jobs in the system?
I would include them. I don't see a reason why to exclude them, but you probably want to change the messaging a bit again. But I would take that as a very positive sign. If people want to be included and they want to know what's happening, even if they're not directly impacted, I would create a separate like communication journey for them. And like this is the wider knowledge of what is happening, because they might not need to know like click here, click there type of button knowledge, but rather why are we making this change and who is going to be impacted. So I would definitely communicate with them as well. There's no such thing as too much communication, except for like the overwhelm. But like if people want information and they actually consume it, then talk to them and share more with them. So yeah, I would definitely set up something separate for them.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. So I'll just, there's one from Lisa here. How might we align the messaging as a matrix sentiment over time where different departments will be dealing with change at different times during a rollout?
Yeah, so that's again where you need to talk to people differently at different stages of the transformation, different sentiments. It comes back to that personalization and making sure that people get what they need when they need it based on their sentiment. So having sentiment as that transformation response data that you can personalize based on is very, very powerful here. And then all of those data points operate in a matrix, right? So you look at sentiment, you look at where they're at in the transformation. And if someone is ahead and negative or ahead and positive, that will be two different ones. So yeah, so utilizing that to make sure that people get what they need based on their sentiment. But personalizing based on sentiment is very powerful.
Great, thank you, Nelly. This has been an extremely formative session. I think everybody can agree there. I love to see all of the members also responding. It's a really good indication of the interaction that you created for us today, Nelly. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone for participating in the ACMP webinar today. And I would especially like to thank Nelly again. So wonderful session. This has been really a pleasure to moderate for you. Immediately following the webinar, the feedback survey will pop up. Please take a couple of moments to complete our survey, as your feedback really helps us to shape future webinars. This recording will be sent out to all registrants of this webinar by early next week. For any ACMP members, it will also be available next week in the webinar section in ACMP's resource library, located on the ACMP website and acmpglobal.org. Don't forget to join the webinar exchange community in ACMP Connect to continue the conversation and engage with our speaker and fellow participants. If you already have your CCMP, remember that by attending webinars, you can earn PDU points, which help you to maintain your CCMP going forwards. So with no further ado, I thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session, next day. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day further.